What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to pretty much my last of the Alien videos as we lead up to Alien Romulus. There's still Alien vs. Predator, but as I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm going to go ahead and cover all of the Predator films before I do Alien vs. Predator, at least the Predator films that I've not yet covered. So without further ado, though, let's get into the last of the main timeline Alien films with Alien Covenant. Let's take a trip back to 2017 for a film once again directed by Ridley Scott, just a few years outside of Prometheus's release, and it stars people like Michael Fassbender once again, as well as a new cast of people like Katherine, Waterston, Billy Crudup, Danny McBride, Jussie Smollett, and many more. So this was one I was really excited to get back to and revisit. If you guys have seen my latest videos, most notably the one for Prometheus, you know that I was really excited to get to that one as well. I was excited to get to the prequels because they're the films in the franchise that I had seen the least. They're the films that I have the least amount of nostalgia for. And I think this is the one that more so out of all of them, I have the least amount of nostalgia for. And I had only seen it once before this in theaters when it originally came out. And if I'm completely honest with you guys, I kind of had a bad taste in my mouth about this movie. It wasn't a movie that I was necessarily clamoring to revisit. I always kind of remembered it as being one of the worst films in the franchise. I was even thinking in my head that it was somewhere around the terribleness of Alien Resurrection, which is without a doubt the worst film in this franchise. And so before we get too far into this, I do want to say a big thanks to all of you guys for watching these videos. And if you jumped in on a couple of these installments, maybe halfway through, or you've been watching all of the Alien videos, I really appreciate you guys taking your time to watch any of these videos, and drop some comments down below letting me know how these films land with you. As I've talked about these movies, there's been a wide array of opinions. Some of the ones I don't like have some people who it's their favorites, and some of the movies that are just absolutely beloved in this franchise. It's been great to hear all kinds of different opinions on it. And then even as we've gotten into these prequel films with Prometheus, I heard a wide array of opinions in the comments already. So I'm looking forward to hearing all the various opinions that this film has, because I do remember that when it came out, it had a pretty kind of lackluster reaction from both critics and audiences. And if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, the scores kind of reflect that. And so I was in that similar kind of boat. But after rewatching all the films, I'm happy to say I actually enjoyed Alien Covenant a lot more, and I think it does a lot more as a sequel to Prometheus and as a prequel to the whole franchise than I actually kind of remembered. Now, one thing that's important to talk about when it comes to these prequels, though, is that, as I mentioned in the last video, Ridley Scott did intend on doing a third film in this trilogy that was meant to expand upon things and kind of give it a little bit more closure. But I'm happy to say at the same time that I think Alien Covenant kind of has a solid ending. Solid enough for you to kind of just understand where it goes, to kind of set up what's to come in the other films. Some may disagree with that, but I think for the most part this film at least has some closure on some things, though I do think, similar to Prometheus, there are a lot of questions in these films that Ridley Scott kind of poses to the audience. There's a lot of big ambitious takes and things that he implements into the lore that is going to have some people scratching their heads, or maybe feel like it doesn't necessarily fully get explanation. And this is the film that in the latter half does a lot for the lore of the Alien franchise, and you're either really going to like it or you're not going to like it. And Prometheus for me was a really great film that introduced the engineers and introduced a lot of other really cool elements to the lore and kind of the early kind of formations of the Xenomorph that we would know and love in the films to come. And so in the case of this film, we see a lot more of that. And so right out of the gate, we have to talk about how this movie opens. We're introduced once again to Guy Pearce as Peter Weyland, of course, the leader of Weyland Corps. And we actually see him with his first moments, pretty much, or at least that's what it's meant to be, with David, the android from the last film, played by Michael Fassbender. At the end of the last film, Prometheus, you had David kind of dismembered, being taken away by Noomi Rapace's character, Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, as they set off in one of the engineer ships to go and find their homeworld in hopes that they can actually meet their makers. Now, there is a bit of a prologue kind of thing that you can find online that is on YouTube that does expand upon some of these things, like the fact that Noomi Rapace's character actually does rebuild David, as well as some scenes with James Franco's character, who's in this film in a very brief cameo, who was meant to be a bigger part of this movie, but we can talk about that in just a little bit. But yeah, so there does get a little bit of a connective tissue, but that film ended with Dr. Elizabeth Shaw and David setting off. And so at the very beginning of this film, we get to go back a little bit further to a younger Guy Pearce as Peter Weyland, as he of course is meeting David. And in this sequence there's a lot of creation lingo that's being spat back and forth to the two of them, of course, David being a being that will long outlive Peter Weyland, and there's a lot about life that's being said in this moment and the idea of life going on forever and ever. And so yeah, that kind of is a theme that we start to get into a little bit later, and we learn a lot about David in this film. But before we do that, we're introduced to another android with the same face as Michael Fassbender, as David, and this one is named Walter. Like the last film, Walter is the only one aboard the ship the Covenant, where we're going to be introduced to a new group of characters, and all these characters are in hypersleep, as they typically are. There is unfortunately a big blast that happens in space, like a seismic wave or something that comes out of nowhere that they weren't expecting, some sort of space weather, so to speak. And they end up having to wake up some of the crucial crew of this vessel in order for them to kind of help repair the shuttle and make sure that all of the rest of the colonists that are on board, there's about 2,000 colonists that are on board, are all safe. And this vessel, the Covenant, is headed to a planet that they actually track down over the course of time that's apparently very habitable for humans, and the objective is to get to this planet and start a whole new colony of humans. So they find this planet, that's the plan. Unfortunately, there's some sort of space weather that kind of shakes everything up. They have to wake up a little bit earlier than intended to repair the shuttle, and amidst this, one of the sleep pods actually combust, and the one that combusts is of James Franco's character, who we end up learning is the love interest of the main character of this film, Daniels, played by Katherine Waterston. And this is actually the first film I saw her in. I'd later see her in the film Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, but yeah, this was the first thing I saw them in, and we get a quick little bit of just context that her and James Franco's character were kind of the ones leading the charge here. He was the captain of the ship. He was the one kind of running the whole show, and yeah, unfortunately, his hypersleep pod ended up combusting, and he was a character that was meant to be a bigger part of this movie, but was cut for a lot of reasons. There are images you can find online where they expand upon that, but yeah, and he ended up kind of just having more of a really small, brief cameo, which is really strange when you look back at it. You even have Danny McBride in here, who's been in a lot of films with James Franco, so it is interesting that James Franco has this incredibly brief role in this film. I would have loved to have seen him have a bigger role. Now, of course, Daniels is distraught because of the death of her lover, and the crew still needs to kind of work together to repair the ship and to continue on with their journey, because they do still have a bunch of colonists that are still in their hypersleep pods, not knowing what the hell is going on. And so now that James Franco's character is dead, you have Billy Crudup as the character of Orem, who is now kind of the second in command, who has now been tasked with being the new captain. And so he's kind of taking to the role with a little bit too much haste. You know, they're all mourning the loss of their captain, their friend. They all kind of want to take a moment to properly, you know, remember him and mourn him. And he's quick to like, hey, we need to get quick to kind of fix the shuttle. We need to continue on with our mission. I know we're all sad. It all sucks, but I need to be the leader here. And so he kind of starts to rub people the wrong way. On their travels, though, and as they start to repair things, and we're getting to know who a lot of these characters are, played by all these various actors, we end up getting a distress call. You're pretty quickly able to kind of decipher that this distress call, or the song that they're hearing, some sort of message that's being sent out, is Noomi Rapace's character. We end up getting that confirmed later in the film, but they end up hearing this call coming from a planet closer to the planet that they're actually headed to. And they end up kind of scanning for the planet and realizing that it has a similar kind of habitat to the one they're headed to. So they're thinking, hey, it's way closer. Maybe this could be where we can bring all the colonists. Maybe it's safe. They end up getting there, and of course, that's exactly not what happens, as they come to this, what seems to be a very beautiful planet, but quickly realize that they are in a very dangerous situation. Not long into landing on this planet, they end up realizing that there's not a whole lot of life there, but it seems beautiful. There's water, there's, you know, tons of lush greens. It seems like this is the right place to be. And not too long into kind of exploring around the world, a couple of guys in their group end up stepping on some sort of plants that end up kind of releasing these spores, and these guys end up getting incredibly sick. And this is kind of a new form of infection that we've seen in the Alien franchise, because more often than not, when it comes down to characters being impregnated by the various creatures, there's usually a creature that does it. There's usually some sort of thing that kind of makes it happen. And in the case of the last film, Prometheus, we saw that the black goo got Dr. Holloway infected, and him having sex with Dr. Shaw allowed her to be impregnated with one of the alien creatures, which was also a different kind of form of seeing that happen. But more often than not, it's the face huggers or something along those lines. But in the case of this, the spores that kind of fly into the air from this black goo that we'll learn about in just a little bit ended up kind of infecting some of these guys, and then they end up having what I think is called a neomorph, which is a white kind of creepier version of a Xenomorph, burst out of their chest. One of them has it burst out of their mouth. I think actually one of them actually has it burst out of their back. So it's a little bit different of a chest burster kind of sequence. And now everybody is just like completely lost. They don't know what to do. They're all terrified. People are getting killed left and right, and a lot of their main group of characters is immediately destroyed right out of the gate by this really cool, interesting, almost cat-like, very fast-paced new kind of Xenomorph. And that's something I really enjoy about these prequels, is that we get to see how these creatures kind of change over time, and depending on how they end up getting impregnated into some of these creatures, they come out a little bit differently. And that's something we'll get into also in just a moment. And so amidst all this madness of everybody being killed off, somebody ends up coming to the rescue with a flare, and that ends up actually being David, the android from the last film, of course played by Michael Fassbender. And so now Michael Fassbender's David and Walter get to meet one another, and they get to have a few very interesting sequences where they talk about life, they talk about life forms. And this is where we start to learn that David is off. His viewpoint on the world, on what's happening, is really messed up. I should also mention that part of the group that landed on this planet initially actually found the spacecraft that had Dr. Elizabeth Shaw on it. They were able to actually clear up that message and see that she was there. Of course, they are not able to find her, and David ends up telling them that they actually crash landed here and that she passed away. We do end up learning, though, that that is not the case, and that David actually killed her. He killed her, and he used her like an experiment, cut her completely open. We end up getting to see her body later on in the film, and this for me is so disappointing. You know, it's something that the Alien franchise does. It's kind of like going from Aliens to Alien 3. You have this great ending where the heroes get away, only for the next film to be like, hey, everybody died in that spacecraft that escaped except for Ripley. And it's just like, man, completely undoes the last film. So with the last film, you're really rooting for Elizabeth Shaw, and then she gets away. She's gonna head off to find the engineers, only for us to find out that off screen she's been killed by David, this android that you don't know if you can trust him or if you cannot trust him. And yeah, ends up being a really sad sequence when you get to see her actual body. It's grotesque. You know, you get to see nuclear paste essentially just cut up and cut open, and we get to see that David has been experimenting with a lot of creatures, and he's been utilizing the black goo and utilizing the Xenomorph and the face huggers and stuff like that to actually create different creatures with the various life forms that were on this planet, which is why they don't see any life forms when they first arrive, which is pretty weird. And it also leads to one of these incredibly weird sequences in the film. It's used for a metaphor of how Walter is, and his version of androids is not capable of creating, because David is of an older model that scared people, and he had the ability to create things with his mind and create solutions, and they didn't like that, so they ended up making the newer models more like Walter, where they maybe have a little bit more sympathy and they don't have this ability to create new things. So there's a sequence with a flute where David and is trying to kind of give him a metaphor, give Walter a metaphor. And it's a very weird sequence where David, you know, has him blow into the flute and says he'll do the fingering. I don't know why the wording had to be like that. I remember watching that in theaters and having people laugh, and it's just a very strange sequence, to be completely and utterly honest. But at the same time, I also like that it has a lot of metaphors in that sequence, and I kind of enjoy being able to decipher and kind of hear how David is so much more different from Walter, even though the two of them look the same. And I think that Michael Fassbender does a really great job of playing these two characters so differently. There are so many moments between the two of them where Walter is just so clearly different from David, and even though they're wearing different outfits where you can tell that they're different, it's their performances and their accents that are really able to kind of sell that the fact that they're different. And anytime I can see the same actor play two characters in the same sequence, I'm always really impressed, and I think Michael Fassbender is still one of the best parts of these prequel films with this film as well. So then the movie progresses on, of course, and we find out that David has his own kind of scheme up his sleeve, and he wants to utilize these kind of colonists and these groups of people that are here now to be either killed by these creatures or use them as experiments in order to impregnate them and create more different types of life. And amidst all this, Billy Crudup's character, unfortunately, is the first one to die to the eggs that are created, the classic Xenomorph egg with the face hugger in it that is created by David. He was waiting to be able to have somebody down there so that he can test them out on somebody, and he does end up getting to do that to Billy Crudup's character, who ends up birthing the first legit Xenomorph as we would know them. And I should also mention that we end up learning that David, after killing Dr. Shaw, arrives to the planet of the engineers. We get to see a bunch of their species. And instead of, you know, getting there and talking to them and trying to learn something about them, he ends up dropping all of the black goo, which of course kills them, all on top of all of them, and essentially just murders the entirety of the engineer race. And you know, this also just furthers the fact that David has just completely lost his mind and just wants to kind of do whatever he can to continue on this murder spree of these crazy beings that just are endless and are able to spawn more and more beings over time. It's pretty crazy, his turn as a character. I mean, you knew he was messed up in the first movie, but in this movie he's even more so messed up. And so yeah, this all leads to all the other characters trying to escape David. They realize eventually that he is a problem. Some of them don't know he's a problem. This ends up leading to a fight between Walter and David. And then eventually, the Xenomorph we know and love, the big black badass one, ends up growing to full size in the quick fashion that they typically do. And a big action sequence takes place on one of the spaceships as Danny McBride's character, Tennessee, comes in to save the day. And I think this is one of the coolest sequences in the movie. Very CG heavy, and you know, you're either going to like that or not like that. But I honestly found it to be a lot of fun to watch. This is kind of where the movie feels like it ends, because they eventually end up killing the Xenomorph, or so you think, only for us to get back to the main spacecraft. It seems like the day has been won, they're gonna escape, everybody's gonna be fine, and for us to end up learning that one of the guys who we thought was okay was actually infected as well. So another Xenomorph ends up coming on board, and there's another action sequence as they try to trick this Xenomorph out of the airlock at a certain point in the film at the very end. And yeah, then the movie ends up ending with everybody thinking that they're safe. You know, it seems like Walter, you know, defeated David. They're all back on the ship. Everything's okay. The Xenomorph has been destroyed. Everybody's been put back into hypersleep as they head back to the original planet they meant to go to at the very beginning of the film. They've lost a lot of people, but now we can kind of, you know, course correct. You know, that's the idea. Only for us to learn that Walter did not survive the altercation with David, and that David had been posing in the latter part of the film as Walter, and that now once he's put everybody in hypersleep, most notably the main character Daniels, and she's about to be put to sleep, she realizes that David is the one who survived. And she learns this by telling him an old story that she had told Walter earlier in the film about how she wanted to build a cabin on a lake with James Franco's character, but David doesn't seem to remember that, and her recognizing that he doesn't remember that made her realize that this is David. But it's too late. She's now being put into hypersleep, and yeah, the movie ends with David setting off on this trip. He has a couple of embryos of the facehuggers that he puts in amidst all the other embryos of human embryos that they're taking to this planet for the colonies. And that's where the movie ends. Unfortunately, like I said, Ridley Scott meant to do another film and never ended up happening. So that is an unfortunate part of this movie, is that it just kind of has an open ending to an extent. But at the same time, I think it does enough to at least show us the birth of the Xenomorph that we know and love. We got to see a couple other versions over the course of Prometheus and this film, and ultimately ends in a way where at least it leads into the fact that, you know, the Xenomorph's like lifespan continues on. You know, David took these these eggs, these embryos of the facehuggers to another planet, and was able to continue using the various colonists there to expand the Xenomorphs to the point where eventually they're a big threat later on in the original timeline of films. Some people don't like that. I totally get it, but for me, I think this movie for the most part does a lot for the lore of the Alien franchise. And going back and revisiting it, I've just been talking about the story as a whole, but I found it to be incredibly well acted. I found that a lot of the action sequences in this film are a lot of fun. There's a lot of tense moments of horror. I think that was one thing people didn't like about the last film, Prometheus, was that it didn't feel as much like an Alien film, whereas this film feels more like an Alien film. There's that alien horror action that you've come to expect. There's a lot of great moments of digital practical effects as well. And overall, I just really enjoy the look, the feel, the vibe, the musical score that calls back to scores from the original Alien films, as well as Prometheus as well, and as well as having its own musical scores as well. Add in performances like Michael Fassbender's or Katherine Waterston or Billy Crudup, Danny McBride. I think this film, for the most part, is one of the more entertaining films to watch in this franchise. And going back and revisiting it, for a film that I kind of had like a experience with the first time and kind of had a bad taste in my mouth with, all these years later, I can genuinely say, after having watched all of them, that I found it to be one of the better films, that I think is actually maybe an underrated film in the Alien franchise. But I think that that's going to be a take that's maybe a little bit of a hot take for some. So definitely let me know down below. Did you guys like this movie? Did you not like this movie? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments. It's been a lot of fun going back and talking about the Alien movies. Of course, there's so much to talk about in Prometheus and in this film, and I've just been kind of jumping around the events that take place in these movies. But ultimately, I've had a lot of fun covering these films, and I look forward to getting into the Predator films that I've yet to cover and covering those, get to Alien vs. Predator, and soon enough we'll be talking about Alien Romulus. Of course, that review will probably be like a lot of my newer movie reviews where I don't get too deep into spoilers, but if there's enough call in the comments, maybe I can do a more in-depth review of Alien Romulus when it comes out, just like this. But whatever the case may be, a big thanks to you guys for watching, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.